On the night that should have belonged to me, our 20th anniversary, Daniel looked me dead in the eyes, smirked, and said, "You're aging like spoiled milk, Evelyn." Then he turned, offered his hand to my younger sister Brielle, and asked her to dance, while I was still standing right there. That moment was my first warning, but not my last. The way his fingers lingered on her waist, the way she blushed like a teenager. I knew something was rotten enough to make the whole world stink. I wanted to believe it was a drunk joke, a passing insult, a stupid moment. But then Brielle whispered something against his neck, and Daniel laughed, the kind of laugh he hadn't given me in years. That wasn't a joke. That was a confession. And the music wasn't covering anything. It was revealing everything. The betrayal burned hotter because it came from both sides. The man I built a home with and the sister I protected like she was my own child. Watching them spin together, touching like they forgot I existed, something inside me cracked. Not in the way they hoped, not in the way that breaks a woman. No. It was the kind of crack that lets light in, the kind that lets truth breathe, the kind that warns you a storm is about to rise. Because the moment Daniel dipped her, like a lover, not a brother-in-law, I realized something chilling. Their affair wasn't new. Their betrayal wasn't small. And what they wanted from me wasn't forgiveness. Stay till the end. You'll see why the dance was just the beginning, and why they should have never underestimated the woman they tried to humiliate. If I'd walked out of that ballroom right then, maybe things would have ended differently. But I didn't. I stood there, smiling like a woman too polite to bleed in public, watching my husband and my sister grind through a slow dance meant for lovers. Every guest avoided my eyes. Guilt travels fast, even when it's not yours. Daniel spun Brielle again, and this time, her hand slid over his chest like she was tracing a map she knew by heart. My stomach tightened. Not jealousy, clarity. That's the moment I realized something heavy. Whatever was happening between them didn't start tonight. I excused myself from the crowd, moving toward the restroom, but not because I needed space. I needed silence. Behind the door, the air felt colder. My reflection stared back. A woman who'd spent 20 years believing loyalty was something she could earn. A woman who had no idea she was sleeping next to a man with two faces. A woman who didn't yet know her own sister would try to take everything she built. The music outside softened, but the muffled laughter grew sharper. His laughter, her laughter, like tiny knives tapping the mirror from the other side. I leaned in closer to my reflection. "You're not crazy," I whispered. "You're catching up." When I stepped back into the hall, the dance was over, but the way Daniel's hand lingered on Brielle's lower back was not. I walked up to them calmly. "Having fun?" I asked. Brielle's smile was sugar-coated guilt. Daniel's eyes slid over me, amused, dismissive, almost bored. "You look tired," he said. "So I thought you'd prefer to sit this one out." My sister chimed in, voice soft, false. "Yeah, Evely, you looked overwhelmed." We were just trying to keep the night light. Overwhelmed. Light. Their dictionary needed burning. I held onto my wine glass tighter, not to steady myself, but to keep from slapping the pity off her face. "Good to know you two care so much about my emotional balance," I said, and I walked away before either of them could taste the sarcasm dripping behind my teeth. But I didn't leave the room completely. I shifted behind a pillar, out of sight, not out of range. Their voices lowered, but whispers carry when people forget walls have ears. "She suspects," Brielle murmured. Daniel chuckled. "She suspects everything. That's her hobby." My hobby. As if their betrayal was some little inconvenience I should ignore like laundry. Then Brielle leaned in. "Be subtle. Not tonight." Not tonight. As if they had a plan for another night. A plan for something worse. Something they didn't want ruined by my suspicion. A cold wave rolled through me then. Not fear, not grief. Recognition. They weren't just having an affair, they were coordinating, timing, managing risk, and the way Brielle pressed a hand to her stomach when she thought no one was watching. That wasn't indigestion. I knew the gesture. Every mother knows that gesture. My pulse slowed, steadying, sharpening. I wasn't looking at betrayal anymore. I was looking at a motive, a future they were building without me. And suddenly, every off comment, every brushed-over lie, every moment that felt slightly off, snapped into place like puzzle pieces clicking together. The late-night texts Daniel hid. The afternoons Brielle stopped by when I wasn't home. The way he defended her more than me lately. The way she glowed, not with youth, but with certainty. A certainty that only comes when a woman believes she's already won. I drifted back into the crowd, letting conversation swallow me whole. My body stood calmly, but my mind split open, cataloging everything. Every look, every touch, every whisper. I realized something important then. Something dangerous. People don't act bold unless they think they're safe. And Daniel and Brielle were acting very bold, which meant one thing. They believed I wasn't a threat. They believed I was too old, too soft, too blind. They believed the woman they humiliated wouldn't dare fight back. They believed wrong. Still, I didn't storm out. I didn't demand answers. I didn't cry. I didn't even confront them. Because I know something they don't. When you catch snakes in your garden, you don't scream. You watch. You study how they move, where they hide, when they strike. Then you decide how to deal with them. Permanently. A waiter approached with fresh champagne. I took a glass, raised it slightly as I spotted my husband and my sister whispering again. My smile was soft, warm, gracious, the smile of a woman who saw nothing, but behind it something colder unfurled, steady and deliberate. I wasn't going to ruin their night. I was going to ruin their lives. And that's when the first real thought settled in, clear as a bell. If they're bold enough to flaunt their affair tonight, what else have they planned? I let that question stay with me as the night continued, because deep inside, beneath the calm surface of my face, a storm began to grow claws, and it whispered the quiet truth that would guide everything that came next. The dance wasn't their celebration, it was their signal. That's when the unease in my chest hardened into something sharper, something useful. That's when I started watching. The first fracture didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with silence. The kind of silence that follows people who are hiding things, the kind that hovers around liars like a fog. 3 days after the anniversary, Daniel came home late. Not suspiciously late, insultingly late. The kind of late that dared me to question him. He tossed his keys on the table, loosened his tie, and walked past me as if I were furniture. No greeting, no warmth, just that smug energy of a man who thinks he's untouchable. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice smooth, even. He shrugged. "Meetings ran over. You wouldn't understand." You wouldn't understand, as if I'd been born yesterday, as if I didn't know the scent of perfume that wasn't mine, as if I couldn't recognize Brielle's floral jasmine anywhere. I didn't call it out. I filed it away. A small fracture. The next one came the following afternoon. I walked into the kitchen to find Daniel on a call. Hushed tone, guarded posture, emotional softness that didn't belong to me anymore. "Yeah, I'll handle it," he said. Pause. "Just don't stress. You need to stay calm." Pause. "You know I want this. I want you." He turned just enough to see me standing in the doorway. Most men panic when their lives are threatened. Daniel smiled. That smile told me everything. He didn't fear me. He pitied me. The fracture widened. I stepped toward the fridge, pretending not to hear a word, but I caught the last line he whispered before hanging up. The one he thought I missed. "I love you, Brie." Not Brielle, not Elle, not even Brie, the childhood nickname I gave her. Just Brie. the name she only let lovers use, a deeper fracture, a cut this time. But the next sign wasn't from Daniel, it was from Brielle. She showed up at my house the next morning, uninvited, cheeks flushed, hair tied messily, wearing Daniel's old college sweatshirt like she owned the fabric. She walked in without knocking. "Morning, Evie," she chirped. Evie. She only used that name when she wanted something. "Unexpected visit," I said, but she was already helping herself to coffee. She reached for a mug, and for a split second, her wrist flicked upward, pulling her loose sweater back, revealing a faint purple mark on her neck. Not a bruise, a bite. Daniel's favorite brand of affection. I stared at it. She noticed, and she tucked her hair behind her ear, pretending she didn't. "So," she said lightly, "are you still thinking about selling your lakeside cabin? Danny told me you were." Danny. My husband. Her Danny. "I never said that," I replied. "Oh? Maybe he assumed." She smiled again. Too wide to be innocent. The fractures were piling up like cracks across a windshield. Then came the moment that nearly told the whole story. She placed her hand on her lower stomach, unconsciously, protectively. The same gesture I saw at the anniversary party. I didn't react. I didn't look twice. But I saw everything. She caught herself doing it, froze, then buried the movement under a laugh. "Must be stress," she said, waving it off. "Stress makes me bloated." Bloated. Right. I had 3 kids. I knew the early signs of pregnancy better than anyone. Brielle didn't have stress bloat. She had something growing inside her, something Daniel gave her, something they planned to build a future on. That was the first moment I felt the air shift. The moment I realized they weren't just betraying me. They were preparing to replace me. And people who want to replace you don't stop at betrayal. They escalate. 2 hours after Brielle left, Daniel texted me a photo. It was a picture of a house listing, a modern place across town. "Thinking of fresh starts," he wrote. "No rush, just consider it." Fresh starts, new houses, new futures. The fractures had become fault lines. And still, I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I didn't crumble. I simply set my phone down and breathed in, slow, measured, cold, because clarity is its own weapon. That night, as Daniel slept beside me, facing the wall, not me, I felt the distance between us like an open grave, a grave they thought I'd fall into on my own. Not yet. Not me. And when the moonlight hit the wedding photo across the room, the one where Brielle stood smiling as my maid of honor, I felt something inside me lock into place. A vow, a promise, a shift. That was the night everything in me whispered the words that would change everything. That's when I started watching. Once I decided to watch instead of react, a strange calm settled over me. The kind that feels like standing on the shore right before a storm arrives, where the sky is too still and the wind holds its breath because everything knows something is coming. I moved around the house differently after that night, not as a wife trying to salvage a marriage or as a sister trying to understand betrayal, but as a quiet observer who had finally stopped pretending she didn't see what was right in front of her. Daniel noticed the change almost immediately, though he didn't understand it, and that was the part that gave me an advantage. He was used to the version of me who flinched when hurt, who softened when ignored, who forgave without asking for details, and he didn't realize that version had died the moment I watched him whisper into my sister's hair on a dance floor meant for me. I answered him with short, steady replies, not cold enough to spark suspicion, but not warm enough to offer comfort. And I watched him fidget with that discomfort like it was a new language he didn't know how to translate. Brielle, on the other hand, grew bolder, almost careless, the way people do when they think they've already won, moving through conversations with a sugary tone that coated her lies just enough to make them sound friendly, but never enough to hide the condescension underneath. She kept touching her stomach, trying to disguise it with little gestures, but every time her hand drifted there, I felt the distance between us widen, stretching into something dark and irreversible, because whatever she was carrying, it wasn't an accident and it wasn't innocent. I found myself performing small domestic actions with unusual clarity, almost ritualistic in their silence. Folding laundry with deliberate movements while replaying every conversation from the last month, or pouring tea slowly enough that I could think through every timeline that suddenly made more sense than it should have. The steam curling out of the cup felt like the truth rising, quiet, patient, undeniable, and the ordinary rhythm of these moments became a sharp contrast to the chaos I knew they were planning beneath the surface. Daniel kept asking where I was going, what I was doing, why I was quiet, but the concern in his voice was unconvincing, almost mechanical, as if he was following instructions rather than feeling anything on his own. I answered him with phrases so smooth and steady he couldn't find anything wrong with them. And watching him try to hide his growing nervousness gave me more information than any confrontation ever could, because nervous people reveal things they never intended to share. One evening, I sat on the couch folding a stack of towels, and I could feel him watching me from the hallway, confused by the fact that I seemed peaceful instead of angry. He took a step closer, then stopped, as if the silence around me carried something he didn't want to disturb, maybe a truth he wasn't prepared to face. "You're quiet lately," he said, keeping his voice low, testing the waters, and I simply looked up long enough to give him a small smile before returning to the towel in my hands. That tiny act, that quiet, controlled indifference, rattled him more than any accusation would have, because it told him I no longer needed explanations. And people like Daniel panic when they realize the person they underestimated isn't clinging to them anymore. Brielle, as always, reacted differently. She started visiting more often, turning ordinary moments into opportunities to inspect me as if she were checking whether I suspected anything. Her laughter got louder, her excuses got weaker, and every gesture felt like she was testing the strength of a rope she hoped would eventually snap around my neck. But I didn't offer her anger, suspicion, or grief. I offered her distance. A polite, measured distance that made her uneasy, because she couldn't tell whether she was winning or losing control. The calmness unsettled her more than rage ever could, and as I watched them both grow more nervous around a woman they thought was losing her grip, I understood something important. Emotional distance isn't about retreating from pain. It's about stepping close enough to see the truth without letting it scorch you. Their world was starting to shake, and they didn't even know the earthquake had begun. The incident that shifted everything from suspicion to certainty arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle before your mind understands why. Daniel had already left for work. Brielle hadn't texted her usual fake good morning message, and the house felt strangely hollow, as if it had been emptied of secrets only because they no longer needed to be hidden. I was walking down the staircase with a basket of linens when my heel caught something unusual, a strange drag on the step that didn't belong, and when I looked down, I saw it. A smear of clear oil spread across 3 wooden steps, nearly invisible unless the light hit it just right. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling the cold understanding ripple through my spine because it wasn't spilled by accident and it wasn't left by chance. Someone wanted me to fall, and not just fall, but fall hard enough to break something that wouldn't heal. I placed the basket down slowly and crouched to touch the slick surface with the edge of one finger, and the texture confirmed what my instincts already knew. This wasn't kitchen oil, it was automotive lubricant, the kind that doesn't dry quickly and leaves a barely noticeable sheen. Daniel had a bottle of it in the garage for his old motorcycle. Brielle didn't know how to use it, but she knew how to follow instructions. The realization settled in my chest with the weight of a stone sinking through deep water. I didn't scream. I didn't gasp. I didn't run to call anyone. Instead, I stood up slowly, wiped my finger on the inside of my sleeve, and walked downstairs the rest of the way with deliberate steps, testing each one before committing my weight. That's the thing about betrayal. Once you see the truth, every movement becomes intentional, every breath becomes evidence, and every silence becomes a choice. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, letting the coolness steady my heartbeat as I replayed the past few weeks with new clarity. Someone wanted me gone. Not divorced, not separated, gone. A widow leaves behind assets, insurance, property, and silence. A divorced woman takes half. And Daniel had always been more comfortable with silence. While I sipped the water, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Daniel. "Be careful on the stairs. I noticed a loose plank yesterday. I'll fix it when I get home." My hand didn't shake, but something inside me tilted because his message came 5 minutes after I almost fell, and the timing wasn't coincidence. It was alibi building, the kind people use when they hope the tragedy looks accidental and they want to show they warned you. The loose plank he mentioned didn't exist. The oil did. I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone and setting it down. His attempt at subtlety insulted my intelligence more than the plot itself. A few hours later, Brielle showed up unannounced, again, but this time her face was slightly pale. Her eyes darting over my shoulder as if searching for evidence her plan had succeeded. She tried to smile, but it came out crooked. "Evie, you look tired," she said, her voice overly soft. "Rough morning?" I held her gaze long enough to let her wonder what I knew. "Just doing house chores," I replied, steady and warm. "Nothing unusual." Her shoulders dropped a fraction, relief slipping through her expression like a crack she didn't manage to hide. That crack told me everything. She expected something to have gone wrong today. And when she walked past me into the kitchen, I saw another detail she tried to conceal. A small tear on her sleeve, the kind mechanics get when they brush up against rough shelving, the kind Daniel always had on his shirts after working in the garage. I followed her calmly, leaning on the counter as she made herself comfortable. "Coffee?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm good." She reached for a mug with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. People shake when they're afraid truth is already breathing down their neck. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence stretched so tight you could almost hear it crack. When she finally left, pretending everything was normal, I waited until her car disappeared down the road before returning to the staircase. The oil was still there, glistening faintly like a quiet confession. I didn't clean it. I didn't photograph it. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I placed a small strip of clear tape across the railing. A trap, subtle enough that no one would notice unless they touched it. If someone tried to inspect the scene, they'd leave fingerprints. Not the kind police use, but the kind I needed. Proof that someone came back to finish what they started. That afternoon, Daniel texted again. "Heading home soon. Be careful, okay?" Careful. He had never used that word with me unless he needed to narrate his innocence. By the time he arrived home, I had already returned to my calm, measured presence, folding laundry with slow, steady precision as if the day had been uneventful. He walked in, kissed my forehead without meeting my eyes, and went straight upstairs. 3 minutes later, the tape on the railing was gone. He had inspected the stairs. He had touched the railing. He had removed the tape because he thought it was a sign I noticed something. But what he didn't know was that I had placed a second, barely visible strip just above the first. That one remained intact. That was how I confirmed it. The man I married had taken the first step toward killing me. I didn't cry, I didn't panic, I didn't confront him. I simply folded the last towel, placed it neatly on the stack, and felt a new resolve settle inside me with the weight of steel. If they wanted me dead, then I needed to stay alive long enough to bury them, socially, legally, and emotionally. And as Daniel walked into the room pretending everything was fine, I smiled softly, because he still believed the woman he was plotting against hadn't noticed the storm he was building. He was wrong. This was the day the game changed. This was the moment revenge stopped being an idea and became a plan. This was the beginning of their ending. The days that followed felt like walking across a field where every blade of grass whispered a secret, and I listened to each one carefully because the danger around me was no longer a suspicion. It was a living thing, breathing in the corners of my home. I moved quietly, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Because the moment I understood Daniel and Brielle wanted me gone, the world sharpened in a way that made every detail important. Daniel thought I was drifting into my usual routines, unaware and forgiving. But I was cataloging his behavior with the precision of someone who finally understood the stakes. He had started checking the mail before I could reach it, deleting his messages more frequently than usual, and clearing browser tabs the moment I entered the room, small habits that would look innocent to anyone who didn't know they were symptoms of guilt. The first micro twist arrived on a Monday evening when he came home with flowers. Not my favorite kind, not even close, but the kind Brielle used to obsess over in high school because she thought white lilies made her look ethereal in photos. He set them on the table and smiled like a man offering peace. But peace is a strange thing. It doesn't smell like perfume I've never worn, and it doesn't tremble in the hands of the person offering it. His fingers shook slightly as he arranged the vase, and for the first time I wondered whether he was afraid of being caught or afraid the plan wasn't moving fast enough. When Brielle visited the next afternoon, she walked straight to the vase and touched the lilies with a tenderness she didn't attempt to hide, her eyes softening just enough for me to see the truth. The flowers weren't for me, they were for her. A silent message delivered through my home, like a signature. She noticed me watching and pulled her hand away quickly, but not before I saw her slip a small, folded paper under the vase, thinking I wouldn't notice. Hours after she left, I lifted the vase and retrieved the note. It wasn't dramatic, just a small torn page with 4 words written in Daniel's handwriting. "She'll be alone tonight." A chill threaded through my spine at the realization that they were communicating through objects in my home, using my space as a meeting ground for a plot I wasn't supposed to survive. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind was busy rearranging every clue into a story more dangerous than I expected, a story in which I was supposed to be the final chapter. Another micro twist came 2 days later when I visited the lakeside cabin, a place Daniel thought I had forgotten, and found evidence someone had been there recently. The curtains were slightly open, a glass on the counter had lipstick that wasn't mine, and a blanket I kept folded was laid out on the couch, warm enough that it hadn't been empty for long. The unmistakable scent of Brielle's body spray lingered in the air, that cheap vanilla fragrance she drowned herself in whenever she wanted Daniel's attention. But something else was off, something more alarming. A copy of our homeowner's insurance policy was left open on the coffee table. Flip to the page that listed accidental death benefits, and the numbers circled in bold red pen. Next to it was a small, sticky note in Brielle's handwriting. "This is enough." Enough for what? Enough for a new life? Enough to replace me? Enough to justify murder? As I stood in the middle of the cabin, the truth formed itself with violent clarity. They weren't planning a slow, subtle disappearance. They were planning something clean, profitable, and final. I locked the cabin behind me and drove home slowly, letting the road steady my pulse while my mind worked through the possibilities. Their plan was rushing forward faster than I anticipated, which meant I had to move swiftly too, but not recklessly. A rushed revenge is messy. I needed mine to be surgical. The biggest micro twist came that evening when Daniel left his wallet on the counter. An accidental carelessness, or maybe a deliberate test. And when it slid open, I saw a small ultrasound photo tucked behind his credit card, dated 2 weeks ago. The name printed on it wasn't mine, it was Brielle's. The due date glared up at me with a cruelty only fate can design. They were building a family, with my husband, in my home, on my grave. I slid the ultrasound back into the wallet exactly where I found it and continued slicing vegetables as though nothing had happened, because that was the moment I understood the most important thing of all. They believed they were ahead of me, but they had no idea how far they had already fallen behind. When Daniel came downstairs later, pretending everything was normal, I smiled at him the same way a storm smiles at a coastline, quiet, brewing, inevitable. And in that moment, I made a silent vow. If they wanted me alone tonight, then tonight would be the last night they ever underestimated me. Truth doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it approaches softly, step by step, until it's standing right behind you, breathing down your neck, waiting for you to finally turn around and face it. By the time the full truth began to unfold, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I was ready, and readiness changes everything. It sharpens your senses, strengthens your spine, and turns every quiet suspicion into a weapon with an edge you can trust. Over the next week, I shifted my routine in ways that made Daniel and Brielle relax, making them believe I was drifting back into the oblivious, dutiful woman they depended on for their cover. I ate dinner with Daniel, asked about his day, folded his laundry, and even listened to his long-winded stories with a soft nod, as if nothing inside me was burning. People who think you're calm stop hiding their footprints. They start walking more carelessly, leaving trails everywhere. One of those trails appeared on a rainy afternoon when Daniel forgot to log out of his laptop before stepping out for a phone call. Normally, he locked everything with paranoid precision, but something about my quietness had made him reckless. I walked past the device slowly, pretending not to care, but when I reached the kitchen, I doubled back, moving silently until the glow of the screen lit my hands. His inbox was open, and right at the top was an unread message from Brielle. The subject line simply said, "We can't wait anymore." I clicked it. The message inside wasn't long, but it was enough to collapse the last remaining illusions in my mind. "Danny, the deadline is coming faster than we planned. I can't keep pretending everything is normal when I'm carrying your child and she's still alive. We need to finish what we started. We need that house, we need that money, and I need you to stop hesitating." A wave of heat rose in my chest. Not panic, not shock, but a strange kind of calm rage, the type that makes every movement deliberate, every breath calculated. The truth wasn't creeping anymore. It was wide open on the screen, shameless and urgent. I scrolled down and saw attachments, scanned documents, my insurance papers, my medical records, a life insurance increase form, and a checklist titled The Accident Plan. The final line read, "After it's done, move fast. People will suspect the sister less than the husband." There it was, the plan, the hierarchy, the logic behind my death. They thought Brielle would avoid suspicion because she was just family, a sister who happened to be around, a sister who loved me. What a beautiful lie to wrap a murder inside. As I read the lines again, something inside me shifted, a cold, steady sensation spreading through my chest like armor. Not just anger or betrayal, but determination. Because now I didn't just have suspicions. I had evidence. I had motive. I had the full truth. But the most important revelation wasn't in the email. It was in the final attachment I almost missed, a voice memo titled Trial Run. I pressed play with a steady thumb. First I heard Daniel's voice, low and annoyed. Oil didn't work. She's too careful. Then Brielle's voice, agitated and trembling. We have to try something else. I'm already showing. I can't hide this forever. And if she figures it out... Daniel cut her off. She won't. She trusts too easily. I nearly laughed at the irony. Then Brielle's voice again, softer this time. Danny, if we don't do this soon, everything falls apart. We lose the house, we lose the money, we lose... A pause. Then a whisper so cold it scraped against the speakers. "We lose each other." I ended the recording, the device clicking into silence so heavy it felt like another voice in the room. That memo wasn't just proof. It was a confession wrapped in desperation, fear, and arrogance. They had practiced. They had rehearsed. They had timed my death like a business transaction. I closed the laptop gently, exactly how I found it, because people who are certain of their victory always return to the scene expecting it to be untouched. A disturbed battlefield would have warned them. I needed them blind. The next micro twist came unexpectedly when I visited my doctor that week for a routine checkup, one I scheduled to maintain normalcy. As I sat in the waiting room, flipping through a magazine without reading a word, the receptionist called me up and said, "Mrs. Ridge, we received your request to add your sister as emergency contact. Just confirming. Should we proceed?" I froze for a fraction of a second. "I didn't make that request," I said. Her face shifted slightly, as if she realized she revealed something she shouldn't have. "Well, it was submitted online," she explained, "using your full medical details." Of course it was. Because if Daniel accidentally wasn't around when I died, Brielle needed to be the one authorities called. She needed to show up first. Cry the loudest, answer questions with innocence dripping from her eyelashes. That wasn't just a detail, that was part of the choreography of my death. I asked the receptionist to remove the request, and she nodded without hesitation. That was the moment I realized something crucial. They weren't just planning a physical accident. They were preparing the paperwork, the timing, the emotional script, the story they would sell to the world. They were building the aftermath before the tragedy. The final major truth arrived the next evening when I found Daniel on the phone in the hallway, whispering urgently. He didn't see me at first, so I stayed in the shadows and listened. "I'll take her to the cabin this weekend," he said, voice low and tense. "It's quiet, isolated, nobody checks in, and if anything happens there—" He paused, then murmured, "Yes, I know. I know what we're doing. I just need you to calm down. It's almost over. She won't see it coming." But he didn't know I was standing 10 feet behind him, hearing every word, watching the shape of his shadow tremble against the wall. He hung up and turned around, and for a brief second, our eyes met. My face stayed calm. His expression didn't change, but something shifted. I saw fear, not of being caught yet, but of the weight of his own decisions. Then he walked past me without speaking, and I let him, because he didn't realize that he had just revealed the final piece of their plan. They weren't improvising anymore. They were scheduling my death, and they believed it was close enough to taste. But what neither of them understood was that the moment they finalized their plan was the moment I finalized mine. I now knew everything. The motives, the timeline, the location, the pregnancy, the financial desperation, the emotional dependency, the rehearsed lies, and the blueprint for my accident. The truth had unfolded, and it was ugly. But I wasn't trembling under its weight. I was standing on top of it, because the storm wasn't coming anymore. I was the storm. Confrontations are never loud when the person holding the real power has already made peace with the truth. They're quiet, steady, and unnervingly calm, the kind of calm that makes guilty people panic because it doesn't match the explosion they were bracing for. By the time I walked into the kitchen that Sunday morning, the air felt thick with the weight of everything I knew, but I moved with a softness that made Daniel and Brielle believe I was just going about my day, unaware of the storm circling above their heads. Daniel sat at the counter pretending to read the newspaper, though his eyes flicked to me with a nervousness he couldn't disguise, and Brielle stood near the sink in that oversized sweater she wore to hide her growing stomach, stirring a cup of tea like she wanted to dissolve the guilt floating inside her but couldn't. I took my time, opening cabinets, pouring myself water, letting the silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable, because silence reveals more than shouting ever will. When I finally turned to face them, I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand explanations. I simply said, "You two look tired," in a tone so even it made both of them stiffen. Daniel cleared his throat, the sound forced and sharp. "Didn't sleep well," he said, eyes darting toward Brielle for a moment. Too long. She looked away, her fingers clenching around the mug, and the gesture was enough to confirm that they had argued earlier, probably about me, probably about whether I suspected anything, probably about how soon they needed to act. I leaned against the counter and took a slow sip of water, letting the moment settle before I added, "You should rest more. Stress isn't good for anyone, especially when something big is coming." Brielle froze. Daniel swallowed hard. They didn't know whether I meant a family event, a life change, or something darker, and that uncertainty tightened the room around us like a noose. I placed the glass down gently, the sound soft but final, and walked toward the refrigerator, opening it without hurry. "I was thinking about going up to the cabin," I said casually, pretending to inspect a jar of jam. It's been a while, and sometimes getting away is good for the mind. Daniel's newspaper shifted as his hand gripped the pages too tightly, crinkling them. "This weekend?" he asked, voice too controlled. "Yes," I replied, closing the fridge slowly. "This weekend." His eyes flicked to Brielle, and in that brief exchange I saw terror disguised as calculation, a silent conversation between them that said everything. She was afraid I had moved the timeline. He was afraid I was suspicious, and both of them were terrified the plan was unraveling. I walked closer to them, keeping my expression warm and gentle, the type of expression only dangerous people learn to master. "You both should relax," I said softly. "Life is unpredictable, but it has a way of bringing the truth out." Brielle's breathing changed, shallow and erratic, and she looked at Daniel as if begging him to speak, but he stayed silent because he was trying to read me, trying to decode whether I was saying something or everything. "I know things haven't been easy lately," I continued, my voice steady and smooth, "but I want you both to know something important." I stepped close enough that Brielle's hand instinctively moved to guard her stomach, and Daniel shifted in his seat like a man preparing for a blow he couldn't see. I smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Brielle's face drain of color. "I forgive you," I said softly. The room snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Daniel blinked. "Forgive us?" he repeated, stunned by the ambiguity. "For everything," I replied. "For every mistake, every choice, every plan." Brielle's mug slipped from her hand and shattered against the tile, tea splashing across the floor, and she stumbled back as if the words themselves had struck her. "Evie, what do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I crouched to pick up the broken pieces of the mug, placing them gently on the counter, and said, "You two should be careful with fragile things. They break easily." Another silence, a deeper fear. Daniel stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, and said, "Evelyn, are you trying to say something?" I looked up at him, eyes steady, heartbeat calm, and replied, "Yes." Another heartbeat. A breath. "And when the time is right," I said, rising to my full height, "you'll understand exactly what." Brielle backed away until her body hit the counter, hands shaking against the edge, her eyes darting between me and Daniel as if waiting for him to explain what she couldn't decode. Daniel swallowed again, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen, and asked slowly, "Are you going to the cabin alone?" I held his gaze for a long, loaded moment before answering. "I never go anywhere alone," I said, my voice low and even. "Not anymore." A flicker of panic lit his eyes, and I watched it spread across his face like a shadow. Then I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them suspended in fear, confusion, and suspicion. Exactly where I needed them to be, because they had no idea what the next 48 hours were going to bring. They had no idea what I had already set in motion, and they had no idea who I had already spoken to. The real twist wasn't that I knew their plan. The real twist was that I wasn't the only one who knew. Revenge doesn't come screaming through the door. It walks quietly, confidently, knowing every step it takes is purposeful. And by the time it reaches the center of the room, the people meant to fear it are already choking on the consequences they never planned for. In the 48 hours after that kitchen confrontation, Daniel and Brielle became restless shadows, circling each other with anxiety so thick it turned their former arrogance into trembling caution. They didn't know where I was going. They didn't know who I had spoken to. And they certainly didn't know the difference between suspicion and strategy, a difference I used like a blade. The first movement of justice began on a quiet Tuesday morning when I drove to the lakeside cabin, not to die the way they intended, but to prepare the stage for their downfall. The place smelled faintly of their betrayal, perfume, sweat, cheap vanilla body spray, and instead of letting the disgust coil in my chest, I let clarity guide me, walking through each room and touching nothing except the things that would matter. Their insurance documents left open recklessly, the red-circled payout amounts, the sticky note with Brielle's handwriting. This is enough. The blanket they used, the glass with her lipstick, the cigarette butt in the ashtray, Daniel's brand. The one he used only at the cabin so I wouldn't know he'd picked up the habit again. I didn't take these things with me. I photographed them one by one. High resolution, perfect lighting, angles that showed context, not just objects. When I left, the cabin looked untouched, because untouched meant innocent, and innocent meant it would stay exactly the way I needed it until the right moment. The second movement of justice was already underway before I even returned home. I had spoken to a private investigator, someone old school and discreet, someone who owed me a favor after I once helped his daughter during a rough patch. I didn't tell him about the murder plot. That part needed precise timing. I simply said I needed digital extraction from a device and a full archive of deleted texts on a phone number belonging to my husband. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He just nodded and said he'd get it done. By the next day, he handed me a flash drive filled with messages that painted the full length of their affair. Dates, times, locations, confessions, arguments, and plans. A trail of secrets that felt like stepping stones leading directly to the trap they had built for me. The third movement came when I made a single phone call. Not to the police, not to a lawyer, but to someone far more meticulous, the family estate attorney. I scheduled a meeting under the pretense of updating my will, and when I sat across from him, I didn't speak about murder or betrayal, because premature truth is wasted ammunition. Instead, I casually asked all the right questions. How long after a death can an insurance claim be filed? If someone tries to change emergency contacts on my medical records without permission, what's the protocol? If my property is left solely in my name, who would inherit if I died without revisions? He answered everything professionally, unaware that each response was another nail sealing Daniel and Brielle's future. By the time I walked out of that office, the entire landscape of their plan had shifted, not for them, but against them. The final movement of justice required an audience, so I chose a family dinner. One of those polite, smiling gatherings where everyone dresses in their best clothes and pretends everything is perfect. Daniel hated public scenes. Brielle lived for public praise. And neither of them would expect a quiet, elegant dinner to become the place where their entire world shattered. When we arrived at the restaurant, the lights were warm, the tables were set with white tablecloths, and our families were already seated, chatting with the pleasant numbness of people who assume life is functioning normally. I greeted everyone with a serene smile, hugging Daniel's mother, listening to his sister's small talk, asking Brielle if she was feeling well. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, and I filed the gesture away with all the others. When the main course was served, I stood up gently, the room falling silent with curiosity rather than fear. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Brielle's face paled. "I wanted to thank everyone for being here," I began, my voice smooth enough to settle nerves before slicing through them. "We've all had a long year, and I believe family deserves honesty, so tonight I'd like to share a few things I've learned." A flicker of panic crossed Daniel's face, but he masked it with a tight smile. Brielle sat perfectly still, fingers twitching beneath the table. I reached into my purse and placed the flash drive, wrapped neatly in a small black box, onto the table. "This," I said calmly, "contains 6 months' worth of messages between my husband and my sister. Every secret meeting, every hotel bill, every plan they made together." Daniel's breath caught. Brielle shook her head fiercely. "Evie, stop!" I continued, unbothered by her panic. "Including messages about the child she's carrying," I added, my voice softening just enough to sharpen the blow. "A child that isn't her boyfriend's or a stranger's, but my husband's." The table gasped collectively, a sound like a wave crashing against rock. Daniel reached out as if to grab the box, but I placed my hand over it calmly. "I'm not finished." I placed my phone on the table and tapped the screen, sending the audio recording from the laptop to a small Bluetooth speaker I'd hidden in my purse. Daniel's voice filled the air, then Brielle's, then the words, "We can't wait anymore. She's still alive. We need to finish what we started." The room froze, horror settling over every face like a blanket of ice. Daniel lunged for the speaker, but his father grabbed his arm, eyes blazing with disgust. Brielle covered her stomach with both hands, tears spilling, not from guilt, but from fear. I stood calmly. No yelling, no shaking, no theatrics. And then I delivered the final line, the one that sealed everything. "I'm giving this to the authorities in the morning. Tonight, I just wanted the people who raised you both to see exactly what you've become." Daniel's mother broke down crying. His father released him with a shove so hard the chair overturned. Brielle's face crumpled into a pale mask of dread. I lifted my purse, collected the flash drive, and added quietly, "Enjoy your evening. It's the last one you'll have as free people." Then I walked out, calm and steady, leaving behind the ruins of 2 people who had tried to bury me. When I stepped out of the restaurant that night, the air hit my skin with a strange softness, almost like the world had been holding its breath for me and finally decided to exhale. The streetlights glowed through a thin fog, the kind that makes everything look slightly blurred, as if life itself was giving me a chance to stand still and breathe in a moment I had earned through fire and patience. I didn't look back at the building, didn't check whether Daniel or Brielle followed me outside, because looking back is something people do when they still feel bound to what they're walking away from, and I had cut that tie long before the truth came out. My car felt warmer than it usually did, the leather soft beneath my hands, and for the first time in months my fingers didn't tremble as I started the engine. Justice isn't a loud explosion or a triumphant shout. Sometimes it's the quiet hum of a car pulling away from a life you no longer have to survive. As I drove home, the city lights passed in long streaks, and each one felt like a reminder that peace doesn't always arrive through forgiveness. Sometimes it arrives through exposure, through accountability, through reclaiming the ground beneath your own feet. When I walked into the house, the silence inside felt different from the silence before. It wasn't heavy or tense. It didn't echo with secrets or calculations. It felt spacious, like emotional oxygen had finally returned to the walls. I placed my purse on the counter, took a deep breath, and made myself a cup of tea. The same quiet ritual I had performed weeks earlier, except this time the steam rising from the cup didn't feel like a warning or a symbol of suspicion. It felt like closure. I sat at the kitchen table, the one where I had once folded towels and listened to the lies unravel around me, and I let my mind settle into the calm that comes after a storm. My hands curled gently around the warm mug, grounding me, anchoring me, reminding me that survival isn't about escaping danger. It's about remaining whole on the other side of it. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed faintly, not urgent enough to suggest chaos, but steady enough to remind me that the world outside was still turning, still correcting itself, still catching up to the truth I had unleashed. I didn't wonder whether those sirens were for Daniel and Brielle. That answer would come soon enough. Instead, I focused on the quiet, the gentle stillness, the reclaimed peace. My wedding ring sat on the table in front of me, a small circle of metal that once meant comfort and future, but had become a symbol of manipulation and danger. I didn't throw it, or smash it, or melt it down. I simply pushed it to the center of the table and let it rest there. Because some things don't need dramatic endings. They just need to be set down and left behind. For the first time in months, I slept deeply, without jolting awake to check if the house creaked unnaturally, without listening for footsteps in the dark. And when the morning sun filtered through the curtains, soft and pale, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that moment. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them. Not of loneliness. Not of what came next. I was free. 5 years can pass quietly or violently, slipping through a person's life like water or carving through it like stone. And for me, those years arrived in a way that felt strangely gentle, like time itself wanted to give me room to heal without rushing my steps. I moved away from the old house not because I feared its shadows, but because peace deserves a fresh foundation. And I chose a small place near the coast where the mornings are slow, and the evenings smell like salt and warm air. People often ask whether I still think about Daniel or Brielle, and the truth is that their faces come to me the way distant storms do, visible on the horizon, loud in memory, but never close enough to disturb the air I breathe now. They served their sentences, shorter than I believed they deserved, but long enough for consequences to reshape the paths they once used to destroy others. And last I heard, they live separate lives, each one scarred by the truth they built together. The child they tried to anchor their future with lives with Brielle's adoptive family now, protected from the chaos that created him. And as strange as it sounds, knowing that child is safe gave me a closure I didn't expect to feel. Some afternoons I sit on my porch with a cup of the same tea I once poured in fear, now held in hands that no longer shake, and I let the steam rise into the air the way the past sometimes rises in memory. Not to haunt me, but to remind me how far I've stepped beyond the edges of who I used to be. That symbolic cup, once filled with suspicion and tension, has become a quiet marker of everything I reclaimed, a soft ritual of freedom instead of survival. I don't hate them anymore. I don't forgive them either. I simply let them exist in a place I no longer visit. And when people ask how I survived what they tried to do, I tell them the same thing I learned the night everything changed. Sometimes being left behind is the fastest way to get ahead. What would you have done in my place? If you've ever trusted the wrong people, this story is for you. Tell me in the comments what part hit your heart the most and where you're listening from. Auntie always loves to know where her stories travel.